It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Architectural Wellbeing Institute's first webinar. I am Thomas Hogg, I'm director of the Institute, and I'm also a councillor at Buckinghamshire Council. So for all the councillors on the call, I'm in your shoes as well. So just to introduce the topic that we're going to be talking about here, our world, it just seems to get more and more complicated. People's mental health seems to be deteriorating. Costs are definitely rising. Climate change is coming, and housing demand is ever increasing, something especially all of the urban designers, planners, councillors are very well aware of. And these seem to be quite unconnected crises. So who would have guessed that planning of all things, would be able to make such a difference to all of these crises simultaneously? Planning is not the sort of thing which you necessarily put together with people's mental health, but by the time this webinar is over today, I'm sure that you'll see it in a totally new light, and you'll be able to see just how much potential we have. The urban world we live in has the power to make or break us. It's something that a rapper from, I think, East London, Tiny Temper, mentioned when he said that the housing estate where he grew up, it was almost designed to make you fail. Everything is connected. Architecture, urban design, health, crime, identity, self-confidence, nothing exists by itself. And this means that everyone in this room today has the extraordinary power to affect how healthy whole communities are through planning, through design codes, because all of us in this room are part of this process. So in this webinar, our panelists will present how cutting-edge technology helped them uncover the unconscious bodily reaction to urban environments, what sort of urban scenes people prefer with a huge data set, as well as how we can convert this into a design code. And finally, what beautiful architecture looks like up close and how it can be both cost-effective and sustainable. We will hear first from Professor Nikos Salingaros from the University of Texas, who is a world-leading academic on how architecture and urban design affect our mental state and behavior. Nikos has won the Stockholm Cultural Award, as well as being ranked 11th in the world of the top 100 urban thinkers of all time. His work has helped mold entire cities. Then we will hear from Susie Moat and Tobias Price, leading data scientists from Warwick University, who've set up the largest study ever done into how various urban environments affect people, including their health and happiness. After them, we have Nicholas Boys-Smith, who many of you will already know. Nicholas is founding director of the think tank and social enterprise CreateStreets, which helps communities mold their own streets, and he is a senior planning advisor to the government as well. And to present along with him, we've got George Paiatis, who is also from CreateStreets, and we'll go through a case study that CreateStreets have done. And finally, we have Professor John Simpson, who has received a CVO for his architectural work for the royal family and has been the architect and urban designer for communities around Europe, for example, in Poundbury and Fairford Lees.
Healthy cities require the cooperation of several conditions. So if only one of those is not satisfied, then the urban experience is a failure. The first component of a healthy city is a fractal physical composition. And I have drawn a fractal here. What is a fractal? This is a design that has many different scales, getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And also you notice that the smaller pieces become more numerous. This is exactly what we see in plants in the forest. When we open up an animal, the body inside is a fractal. Now, the animal itself has to be more compact because it has to move. The animal means that something is moving. The healthier cities have a fractal composition, and you have one large piece and a few intermediate-sized pieces and very many smaller-sized pieces. This is, again, the secret to the complex system that the healthy city is. When we have a structure, then we magnify it. A healthy structure has complexity, regardless of how many times you magnify it. When you see a magnification that leads to blankness, then something is wrong, because that scale is not supported. We also have things that we require as animals, namely symmetry about the vertical axis. This is something very important. Because our brain, the human brain that is, which is a human only in the last few cell layers. The rest of the human brain is the animal brain and the mammalian brain. It requires connection to certain type of geometries. And then we perceive urban spaces like this one. So I'm jumping into experiments using eye tracking and visual attention software. So what my group of researchers have found is that this fairly typical urban space is dysfunctional, because when we look at it for the first 3 seconds, the eye picks up the 2 parking signs and just a little bit of reflection on this dreary little canal. The enormous expense of building this with the 2 groups of buildings on either side and the pavement, don't forget the pavement, is almost invisible to the human eye. It's not an aesthetic failure. It is a physiological failure, because if we want to go to a store in the foreground here, we have to force ourselves. There is a cycle that recurs about every 3 times a second. And if you force yourself to move in a direction that your body does not naturally feel towards, going towards, it creates a stress. So this is another very simple and amazing. Look at this award-winning minimalist building with a glass facade or a concrete facade. When we do the eye tracking, the eye refuses to look at it. It goes to the corners. Okay, so we fail to engage with this. Even if it has won a RIBA award, it's useless. We fail to see it. And if we're next to it, it will cause stress. How do we fix that? Well, Professor Simpson knows. We put in some ornament, now looked down upon by certain people in the establishment. Look how the eye immediately engages with the ornament. Okay, I want to emphasize again that this is less than 3 seconds. The body reacts because of millions of years of evolution. We cannot control this reaction. After a minute or 2, then the brain starts to think, oh, well, you know, I like this sort of design, but the body does not lie. We need this kind of facade to bound the urban spaces that we build from now on. Otherwise, we're just wasting our time. Look at this example. By just juxtaposition, we have a more traditional building in front of a glass skyscraper. The eye refuses to look at the building in the back. It just doesn't exist there. Of course, if you're next to it, it's just menacing and giant and it's alien. It is essential to put in nature, small pieces of nature, intense nature, in what we build today. You don't have to build a giant park. That's a luxury. But small, intense pieces of nature really give the biophilic effect. The biophilic effect is what attracts us to nature, and it corresponds to a healing effect measured by doctors. In conclusion, how do we build this kind of city? Well, we have a group of friends who have developed the design rules, who know how to implement them. They have developed the design codes to be adopted by forward-thinking constituencies. Everything is ready. All we need is the implementation and the will to do that.
Thank you very much, Thomas. My name is Tobias Preis, and this is my colleague Susie Moat. We are both professors of behavioral science at Warwick Business School and both fellows of the Alan Turing Institute, the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI.
Now, this is a picture of a street in Edinburgh. Now, I did my PhD in Edinburgh and I absolutely loved being there because it was a beautiful city. And I confess I was more than a little heartbroken when I had to leave. So Tanuki, Tobias and I were looking at photographs like this. And we were wondering is there maybe not some way that we can use this vast volume of online photographs to start to get some sort of quantitative insight into the relationship between how a place looks and how well we feel? So we were really delighted to come across a game called Scenic or Not. Now, Scenic or Not was developed by My Society, an organisation here in the UK, back in 2009, and we're now very happy to host it in our data science lab. Scenic or Not is a game. It shows you photographs like this, and it asks you to rate them between 1 and 10. So if you think it's very scenic, you can give it 10. If you think it's awful, you can give it 1. And in turn, the photographs come from another online project called Geograph. So on the back of Scenic or Not and Geograph, we have over 1.5 million ratings for over 200,000 locations right across Great Britain. And if we plot this data for England, then this is what you see. So on this map, darker areas are areas that have been rated as more scenic. So for example, up in the north, you can see the Lake District in dark purple, which is where this beautiful photograph in the background was taken. You can also see, if you look down towards the southeast, that cities such as London are not doing so well. Now, here in England and Wales, we have a census that's carried out every 10 years. And one of the questions on this census asks people to report on how healthy they feel. So we wondered, well, what would happen if we put this data on how scenic locations are together with the data from the census? And what we found was that people who live in more scenic locations report their health to be better. Now, we did wonder, is this maybe just a question of whether people live in the city or the countryside? But we found that even if you just look at urban areas or suburban areas, this relationship still holds. We also wondered, well, could it be something to do with pollution? Might it be something to do with there being greater socioeconomic deprivation in less scenic areas of cities? We tried to plug these variables in too, but they still didn't explain the relationship. We also wondered, is it possible we've just found a really complicated way of measuring how green different places are? Measuring how green places are has traditionally been a bit easier than measuring how scenic somewhere is. You can work it out by just taking some aerial photography. But we found that in cities, in urban areas in particular, if you want to best explain how healthy people feel, you really need to take this data on aesthetics into account. It's not enough to just look at data on green space. Now, we should stress that at this point in time, this is evidence of a correlation. We can't tell you that we have demonstratively proven that living in a more scenic area is going to make you more healthy. But even if we did have evidence of a causal relationship, you might ask, well, what's behind it? Do people do more exercise in more scenic locations? Or are they perhaps just happier in more scenic locations? Now, happiness is an interesting topic because that's also something that has traditionally been very hard to measure. And so for that reason, we were delighted to start working with George McCarran from the University of Sussex, who had developed an app called Mappiness. So Mappiness pings you a couple of times a day. It asks you how happy you're feeling. It asks you who you're with. It asks you what you're doing. And so on the back of Mappiness, we have over 3 years of data for over 15,000 people. Are people really, truly happier when they're in more scenic locations? And the answer is quite clearly yes. Even if we look at whether they're in natural or built-up locations, whether they're in green locations, whether they're in urban, suburban, or rural locations, the income of local inhabitants, and many other things that we don't have space to fit on this graph. So we were really excited to find these results, but it does rather leave open the question, well, what actually makes a place more scenic? Now, we have to confess, we did not get very far trying to look at our 200,000 photographs and trying to work out, well, which ones had got the highest ratings and why. But thankfully, we were able to delegate this task to a computer. Computers and AI have got much better at working out what is in a photograph. So what we did is we took our 200,000 photographs and we fed them into a deep neural network, that's a kind of AI, called Places CNN that had been developed by some researchers at MIT. So if I feed in this photograph that's called 10 on Scenic or Not, for example, then Places CNN tells us what sort of area it thinks this is, tells us you know, thinks there's a valley, a lake in there, maybe a mountain, and also gives us some information on the attributes of the scene. So using Places CNN for all of our 200,000 photographs, we get over 300 features. And so if you like statistics, you can feed that data into a statistical model and you can finally find out what makes people rate places as more scenic. But if we look at just the data for urban built up areas where many of us live, then you start to see that the story is not quite that simple. So for example, we start to see that built elements can really boost the scene as well. So for example, buildings with character, such as cottages or castles, and indeed bridge-like structures such as viaducts or aqueducts. At the same time, really importantly, we see that not all green space is the same. So while trees, for example, boost the value, the scenic value of an area, large areas of grass, like athletic fields, actually tend to bring it down. So there's a real question here over the quality of the green space, not just the fact that it's green. And these observations help explain some patterns we've seen whilst looking at data from Buckinghamshire with Thomas. So for example, you'll see that this photograph on the left, where you can see some green space, you can see some trees in there, only scored 1.6 on Scenic or not. Whereas this photo on the right, where there's much less green space, did much better. And, you know, arguably there, the buildings have got more character.
Indeed, when we looked at the photographs of London that our Scenic AI had rated as being in the top 5%, we found it has chosen pictures of places like Hampstead Heath. But at the same time, in line with what we have just presented to you, we found that our Scenic AI had picked out pictures of built locations as well, like Big Ben, for example, or the Tower of London. And whilst most of us might not be planning to go and live in Big Ben or the Tower of London, this does illustrate how awe-inspiring outdoor spaces can be created by humans, not just forces of nature, to boost both scenic value and therefore perhaps also the well-being of local inhabitants.
So together, our results suggest that scenic places might have consequences for our health and our happiness. And crucially, making urban areas scenic is not simply about making them green. Beautiful buildings have a really important role to play as well.
We do a lot of work, a lot of co-design work. This is working with an architect, Francis Terry, with community groups up and down the country. We're very keen on, actually in the same spirit of what Professor Moat was just saying, of sourcing as much data as possible about what people like and where they want to be. So we have various platforms, we'll come to that, to do that, jump over that. And then we actually try and put it all together. So working with people such as Professor Simpson and my own design team, we then try and weave back together bits of town that have been ruined over the years and put together design codes or visions or for master plans for good new developments. This is development we are working on in Devon. So I'm just going to talk for a couple more minutes about how, for those of you who are councillors or who perhaps own land or wish to control it or do control it, how you can make for more effective places and how to some degree you can bring some of the planning risk forward. And so just a little bit of context for those of you, which I assume is all or most of you in the UK, is that the planning system has changed, actually quite important in the last few years. So that's something called the National Planning Policy Framework, a document that those of you who are professional planners will know very well, now has a very clear ask for beautiful placemaking right at the highest level. So that's set alongside sustainable development as an aim of the planning system. And then specifically in paragraphs 127, 128, 129, also in the early 130s, gives really quite clear hooks, as planning lawyers say, for popular, beautiful placemaking, co-designed with the local residents. So whatever developers and landowners want to happen, there's now a very clear ask. And we're already certainly starting to see that change. And as again, some of you will know, there was a National Model Design Code published last year, which now is guidance for me within the system. So the reason that we would say often a good way, and it's important to slightly caveat, of taking advantage of some of the increasing research on better places, the reason we'd, I think, often say that good, clear visual design code is the right way to do that, is it allows greater certainty as to what the outcome is, and critically then allows a greater number of small developers, builders, SMEs, self-build, custom build, to operate within that clear regulatory framework. So 7 key principles for creating a good design code that we would pull out, and other ways you could look at this. And I should stress I'm speaking on behalf of CreateStreets at the moment, so this is very much our approach. I'm going to do a few, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague George just to talk about some of the work he has recently been doing on the ground. The first is actually do be aspirational. So do have a clear vision for what you want to make better, because if you're not setting a clear vision for making a place better, I can guarantee it won't happen. The second, again, picking up on some of the themes that we've just been looking at, is do fit in with the policies and the research on the evidence of what makes for happy, healthy, popular, sustainable places. I'm not saying this is our little list of 8 here, which I'm going to go through in a moment. I'm not saying this is the perfect list. I think it's not a bad list of summary of the evidence of those things. So gentle density, taking advantage of the advantages of propinquity, but also the proven human need for personal space. Nikos touched on this. Places which weave greenery little and often through the landscape. Loads of street trees. Absolutely agree. The data on street trees is really staggeringly strong in terms of their association with greater human health. Beauty really matters. So this is actually from again from a master plan we're currently working on. And what humans like is really quite predictable, what most people refer. I think the comparison there is clear. And if you don't believe me, you can then see that in the pricing data. So this is from some research done about 4 years ago, from some research we did, where we looked at every single property sale in 6 British cities, and then did a multivariate analysis back to the elements of urban morphology that we could sort of get the big data on. And actually you can get more now, we need to redo this data. But in a nutshell, what we found was that the premium for more traditionally conceived places with a higher connection node, which is a measure of traditional street pattern, higher proportion of older buildings, was between 4 and 7 times greater than the new build premium. So we used that tool that Chanuki and Susie created and looked at the ratings of individual places and then compared them to the big data elements of urban morphology. Now I've simplified it simply, but looking at London, these were the elements of urban form that were associated with more popular places. And I guess to pull that to life, so these are some of the lower scoring places, say in London, grey, dreary, either over enclosed or under enclosed. And these were some of the highest scoring urban places. And they tended to have a very similar pattern, which was high urban richness, high variety in a pattern, quite well enclosed, often though not quite always greenery in, but yes, very much not great big suites of astroturf. And again, this is a Dutch study which found a similar relationship with that the better places, better designed with a richer variety in a pattern of facade pattern, was selling at a 15% premium. And again, this is from some polling we did where you get very clear patterns in the types of places that people prefer. If you don't know, it's the one on the left, and it's the one above. And we've actually done more sort of technically correct, I think, visual preference surveys since. And you can also see that this then influences people's behavior. So when you get volunteers posing as lost tourists in front of these 2 buildings, 5 times as many people offer to help the lost tourists spontaneously in the building on the left versus the building on the right.
Not just creating sort of endless estates of semi-detached homes. I think to create vibrant, sustainable, attractive and beautiful places, they really need to be mixed use, whether that's creating schools and putting them in the centre of a development, or having retail use on the ground floor. It activates the streets and brings people into a place and makes sure that residents are interacting with one another. Co-creation and engaging with the community is an essential part of successful design coding. It's all well and good creating these principles from afar, but we really do believe in working with the community, whether that's through workshops, in-person design events, or online consultation platforms.
The buildings need to be arranged together so they define a series of connected outdoor spaces, as you see here, rather than just buildings scattered randomly as you get on a housing estate like this. And it's only then that you get places where people can gather together, enjoy the space outside their homes with their friends, as they do here in this main square at Dickens Heath, a new freestanding settlement of about 2,500 houses that we built just over 10 years ago in Solihull outside Birmingham. It incorporates shops, a supermarket, a pub, hotel, affordable housing, business units, as well as public buildings such as a school, health centre, and public library. There are restaurants opening out onto the square for people to enjoy, and the public realm is designed as a network of interlinked open-air external spaces, as if you were creating a series of rooms in a vast open-air outdoor building. This inevitably means more connected terraced buildings with no wasted space in between, bringing the buildings closer to the back of pavement, either with smaller front gardens, as you see here in our development at Vincent Square in London. So there's less space given over to large front gardens. By design and with judicious use of railings along the street, as here in Chelsea, incidentally, these are all new buildings, where the walls and the garden fences are used so there's no loss of amenity and privacy. It's no use providing green space, as you see here, on a housing estate that lacks privacy, is spoiled by parked cars, and is too public to enjoy. Just compare that with these houses we built in Poundbury in 2009. The essential thing to remember is that by creating workable communities using streets, walkable communities using streets, squares and lanes in the traditional manner, you get a much more efficient use of land. This approach not only results in a more pleasing environment for people, but also in a saving on land. Walkable settlements are all to do with designing places that relate to an easy 5-minute walk. You begin almost as if you're designing a series of villages, 5 minutes walk apart, each with a green or a square, then putting in the infrastructure, the highways, businesses, schools, and such like, then the structural landscape before filling it in with the rest of the buildings to create a mixed-use settlement with individual neighborhoods. This way, each neighborhood is designed with its own center and landmark buildings to go with it, such as here at Bummery Square at Poundbury, where we built this market building and community hall in the year 2000, the first public building to be built at Poundbury. By making them visible from a distance along streets, or with a feature like a tower, people can recognize where they are, and so they can find their way around. The main issue today is usually to do with cars, where we have to deal with very high levels of car ownership and need to find places to put them all. As you can see here at Dickens Heath, there's only so much you can deal with on the street, and it looks absolutely terrible. In Workingham, which is another area of high car ownership, the local authority requires 3 on-site car parking spaces for every 3-bedroom house. And this is where the concept of the Mews comes into its own. A Mews is the hole that's left over in the center of an urban block once you've set the buildings so as to define the public spaces that become the streets, lanes, and the squares around the edge. This Mews space can then be used to provide the parking needed on site for the terraced houses, even up to 3 cars per plot, arranged alongside other houses in the Mews or with small flats over the garages, so that they don't become unmanageable garage courts, as you see here at Poundbury. The beauty of this is that it also provides a reasonable space at the bottom of the garden where some of the house owners may improve and upgrade their properties as life progresses by building above the car parking space a small home office or an annex for a granny flat or for teenage children to live. And as circumstances change, they don't have to move. And the beauty of this is that most of these uses don't usually generate a requirement for additional car parking. And then you can also have opportunities for small startup businesses or workshops, which would be difficult to introduce into a street context. As you can see here, examples where this already exists in the context of a traditional London mews. So the advantage for the buyer is that they get a more attractive, convenient lifestyle because of the arrangement of houses and uses, where distances locally are not as large and people can get to where things are happening quite easily without having to be reliant on their motor cars. You have your own local facilities in your neighborhood, so you can organize local community events, farmers markets, street events, and so on, and they're easy to get to. With a denser population, other uses reliant on footfall, such as this pub at Poundbury, can become viable, or this cafe at Dickens Heath. So space for such facilities becomes a realistic possibility, which in the current climate, with more people working from home, makes for a more convenient and enjoyable life close to home. More sustainable and cheaper to run. If you have a terraced house, it inevitably has less external wall, so it's very likely to result in lower heating and fuel bills. Less external wall also means less aggravation and less maintenance. Flexibility for the future and possible development opportunity. The Mews gives a family long-term flexibility, so the house has a greater opportunity to be adapted and extended as circumstances change. In some circumstances, this may even make it possible to run a business from home. This is a pair of Mews cottages that we recently added to a Mews in London, accessed through this arch. It's also a development opportunity that will add value to the property, something people sometimes look for when buying a house. A property in a development like this is also likely to hold its value better. A report that Savills produced in 2019, together with the Prince's Foundation, called The Value of Community, looked at Poundbury and Fairford Leys and Aylesbury, which was one of our first urban extension master plans finished in the 1990s, and compared them with equivalent properties in the area. It showed that properties designed in this manner command a premium and hold their value almost 27% higher in some cases, compared to similar houses built on a housing estate. It's the same reason why, unsurprisingly, properties in villages and pretty town centres command a premium compared to housing estates. For the developer, you get more houses on less land, which inevitably generates a better return. You create a beautiful product in a context and an environment that people like, which only sells faster, but according to Savills, even commands a premium. It's a win-win situation that generates more value. With the Mews, you also have an attractive feature to sell, providing flexibility and future development opportunity for the buyer. More terraced buildings, as I've said before, also means more shared walls between buildings. You're effectively halving the amount of external wall, which is potentially one of the most expensive elements of the construction of a house. This allows you to put more into building more durably, using natural materials that will last, making the development more sustainable. And then you have new technology, which provides architectural opportunities to do things that previously were unaffordable. CNC machines can be linked to digital drawings to automatically carve wood, stone, and other materials straight off the design drawings. This makes them for a much more bespoke and attractive design, and makes it affordable, which doesn't rely on generic off-the-peg catalog items that most house builders have had to rely on to date. From society's point of view, of course, you've got greater well-being and a more sustainable future with a more varied and beautiful environment for people to live in. Most importantly, I should add, is that developments like this are much more compact, so they don't use up so much of the precious countryside we have left. Considering the amount of housing we need to build, this is a most important